the 17th of January, 1943. Wilhelmshaven, northern Germany. The sky over the industrial port city hung heavy with winter clouds, their underbellies reflecting the dull glow of factory fires and street lamps rationed by blackout regulations. In the frozen darkness 3 miles above, Lieutenant James H. Howard gripped the yoke of his B-17 Flying Fortress, feeling the aircraft shudder as flak bursts erupted in orange blossoms around his formation. Through the plexiglass nose cone, Bombardier Sergeant Carl Swenson hunched over a mechanical marvel, the Norden Bombsight, a device so secret it was carried in a locked vault and guarded more closely than gold. His gloved fingers made minute adjustments to the gyroscopic dials. Below, through breaks in the cloud cover, the U-boat pens and shipyards of Wilhelmshaven sprawled like a steel labyrinth. This was the first major American daylight bombing raid over Germany. The 8th Air Force had come to prove a doctrine, to validate a theory born in peacetime classrooms and tested in the crucible of war. But what America would learn in the frozen skies over Europe would reshape not just bombing strategy, but the entire technological trajectory of aerial warfare. 11 months earlier, American bombers had no such confidence. In the spring of 1942, when the United States Army Air Forces began arriving in England with their silver B-17 seconds gleaming in the pale British sun, they carried with them an unshakable belief in daylight precision bombing. It was a doctrine forged in the 1930 seconds at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama, refined in academic debates and illustrated with grainy films of bombs striking pickle barrels in the Nevada desert. The theory was elegant. Fly high, fly in formation, use the revolutionary Norden bombsight to strike with surgical precision, and destroy the enemy's industrial capacity without the indiscriminate slaughter of area bombing. The British, bloodied and exhausted after 3 years of war, had already abandoned daylight raids. Their Lancaster and Halifax bombers flew only at night, dropping their payloads across entire city blocks because hitting a specific factory in darkness was considered impossible. Royal Air Force commanders looked at the arriving Americans with a mixture of pity and admiration. Pity for the losses they knew were coming, admiration for the courage required to fly unescorted into German skies in broad daylight. But doctrine and reality are separated by the unforgiving distance between theory and combat. The Americans believed their Norden bombsights would revolutionize warfare. Developed in the 1930 seconds by Dutch immigrant engineer Carl Norden, the device was an analog computer of extraordinary complexity, a maze of gears, mirrors, and gyroscopes that could calculate wind speed, altitude, ground speed, and trajectory in real time. In test conditions over the Arizona desert, bombardiers dropped practice bombs into 30-foot circles from 20,000 feet. General Henry Hap Arnold proclaimed it could place a bomb in a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. The military invested over $20 million in its development, shrouded it in classification levels that exceeded those of many atomic research projects, and built an entire bombing doctrine around its capabilities. American crews were trained to believe that precision was not just possible but inevitable, that their technological superiority would allow them to strike at the heart of Nazi industry while minimizing civilian casualties. It was a noble vision. It was also built on a foundation that had never been tested under the conditions that actually mattered. Night bombing was not part of that vision. American planners in 1942 understood that darkness offered protection from enemy fighters and reduced losses to flak, but they viewed it as fundamentally incompatible with precision. The Norden bombsight required visual acquisition of the target. A bombardier needed to see the factory, the rail yard, the bridge to identify it, track it, and make the microscopic adjustments that transformed a falling bomb into a guided instrument of destruction. In darkness, all of that vanished. The British had learned this brutal lesson through years of trial and error. Their early war raids had attempted precision at night, only to discover that crews often could not even find the correct city, much less a specific building. By 1942, RAF Bomber Command under Arthur Harris had committed fully to area bombing. Saturation attacks, designed to destroy enemy morale and industrial capacity through sheer overwhelming force. The Americans rejected this approach, not just tactically but morally. The U.S. Army Air Forces saw themselves as engaging in a cleaner, more civilized form of warfare, one where technology and skill replaced brute force, where enemy combatants could be separated from innocent civilians through the precision of American engineering. The first test of this doctrine came not over Germany, but over occupied France. On the 17th of August 1942, a dozen B-17 seconds of the 97th Bombardment Group struck the Sotteville-les-Rouen railway marshalling yards near the French coast. It was a modest mission, heavily escorted by RAF Spitfires, against a target with minimal defences. All aircraft returned safely. Bombs struck within the target area. Headlines back home proclaimed American precision bombing a success. But Rouen was barely 100 miles from England, within easy reach of fighter escorts, and defended by second-line German units. The real test would come deeper into occupied Europe, and eventually into the Reich itself. As American bomber groups multiplied through late 1942 and early 1943, the missions grew more ambitious. Targets shifted from French rail yards to industrial centres in the Low Countries, then to the Ruhr Valley, and finally into the heart of Germany. With each mile deeper into enemy territory, the truth that British commanders had tried to warn them about became impossible to ignore. Daylight bombing without long-range fighter escorts was suicidal, and even with escorts, European weather made precision impossible for months at a time. The weather over northern Europe is among the most hostile to aviation anywhere on Earth. Cloud cover blankets the region for weeks on end, particularly in winter. Fog rolls off the North Sea and shrouds cities for days. Rain, sleet, and snow create icing conditions that can tear wings from aircraft. For American crews trained in the clear skies of Texas and Arizona, the English climate was a shock. Missions were scrubbed day after day as meteorologists reported solid cloud cover over targets. When raids did proceed, bombardiers often arrived over their targets to find them completely obscured by clouds. The Norden sight, for all its technological sophistication, could not see through weather. Crews were forced to bomb by dead reckoning, by radar, or not at all. Many simply dropped their payloads on estimated positions and turned for home, never knowing whether they had struck anything of value. Reconnaissance photographs taken days later, when weather permitted, revealed the grim truth. Bomb craters scattered across farmland miles from the intended targets, factories untouched, rail lines operational. The precision doctrine was failing not because of enemy action, but because of meteorology. Simultaneously, German defences were evolving at a terrifying pace. The Luftwaffe fighter force that met American bombers in 1943 bore little resemblance to the one that had fought the Battle of Britain. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf Fefdu 190 seconds now attacked in coordinated formations, pressing their attacks from head-on, where bomber defensive guns were weakest. German pilots discovered that the tightly packed American combat boxes, while providing mutual defensive fire, also made ideal targets for air-to-air rockets and heavy cannon fire. On missions deep into Germany without fighter escort, losses reached catastrophic levels. The 14th of October 1943 raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants saw 60 B-17 seconds shot down out of 291, dispatched a loss rate over 20%. At that attrition rate, a crew's chances of surviving a standard 25-mission tour were statistically negligible. The bomber formations were bleeding to death in the German sky, and the doctrine that justified those losses, precision strikes that would cripple Nazi industry, was achieving only modest results, because half the time, weather prevented any precision at all. The American airmen flying those missions expected glory. They had been trained on newsreels showing bombs striking targets with mechanical perfection, had listened to briefings emphasizing their role as precision warriors, had absorbed the cultural narrative that American technology and ingenuity made them invincible. Many were barely old enough to drink, small-town boys from Iowa and Georgia who had never left their counties before the war, now expected to navigate across hostile territory at 25,000 feet in unpressurized aircraft, where temperatures dropped to 50 below zero. What they experienced instead was chaos and terror, the shriek of flak shrapnel tearing through aluminum, the scream of diving enemy fighters, the horror of watching a neighboring bomber disintegrate in a ball of flame, knowing that 10 men just like them were dying in that instant. They learned that the Norden sight's vaunted accuracy meant nothing when clouds hid the target, that their formation's defensive firepower could be overwhelmed by determined attacks, that the doctrine they had been taught assumed conditions that rarely existed in reality. Night missions were considered even more hopeless. The handful of American night raids attempted in 1942 ended in disaster. Without visual reference points, navigation became guesswork. Formations scattered across hundreds of miles of sky. Crews bombed empty fields or, in several embarrassing incidents, neutral countries. In one mission over France, lost bombers dropped their payloads on Switzerland, causing a diplomatic crisis and proving to American commanders that their daylight precision doctrine had no nighttime equivalent. The British, meanwhile, continued their nightly area bombing campaigns, accepting the moral compromise of striking entire cities because their technology offered no alternative. By late 1942, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany had devolved into two parallel but incompatible approaches. The Americans attempting precision by day and achieving mixed results when weather permitted, the British conducting area attacks by night with no pretense of accuracy. Neither side had solved the fundamental problem that would determine the air war's outcome: how to strike precise targets regardless of darkness or weather. The answer would come not from doctrine but from desperation and technological innovation. The same American industrial and scientific establishment that would produce the atomic bomb was already working on radar systems that might make blind bombing possible. Radar itself was not new. British chain home stations had won the Battle of Britain by detecting incoming German raids, but miniaturizing the technology enough to fit in an aircraft with sufficient resolution to identify specific ground targets represented an enormous engineering challenge. The British had made progress with their H2S ground mapping radar, which provided crude images of coastlines and cities, allowing navigators to determine their position over blacked-out Europe. But H2S imagery was too imprecise for anything like American precision bombing standards. A city appeared as a bright blob on the cathode ray tube. Individual factories were invisible. What was needed was radar with resolution fine enough to distinguish a specific industrial complex from surrounding buildings, coupled with computing systems sophisticated enough to solve the bombing problem without visual reference to the target. That breakthrough came in the form of two related technologies: refinements to the Norden bombsight to accept radar input, and the development of the H2X radar system called Mickey in American slang, which offered dramatically improved ground resolution compared to British H2S. The H2X operated at a higher frequency, giving it the ability to resolve smaller objects on the ground. An experienced radar operator could distinguish rivers, road junctions, and even large buildings. Crucially, H2X could see through clouds and darkness with equal clarity. The system was rushed into production in late 1943, with modified B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds carrying both the H2X radar and bombardiers trained to interpret the green phosphorescent images on their scopes. These aircraft became pathfinders, leading formations to targets that no one could see with the naked eye. The radar operator would identify the target on his scope, feed corrections to the bombardier, who would then use a modified Norden sight to calculate the release point based on radar data rather than visual tracking. It was precision bombing by instrument alone, a concept that would have been dismissed as fantasy just 2 years earlier. The first major test of radar bombing came during the Battle of Berlin, that brutal winter campaign of 1943–44, when RAF and American bombers struck repeatedly at the Nazi capital despite weather that should have made any bombing impossible. On the 13th of December, 1943, the 8th Air Force dispatched 710 bombers toward targets in northern Germany, with H2X-equipped pathfinders leading each formation. Cloud cover was solid from England to Berlin. No bombardier saw the ground that day. Yet post-strike reconnaissance revealed significant damage to industrial facilities, including the Focke-Wulf assembly plants that were primary targets. The bombs had not landed with peacetime test precision, but they had struck close enough to their aim points to justify the mission. More importantly, they had struck at all something that would have been impossible with visual bombing alone. The doctrine was adapting. American precision bombing was not being abandoned, but rather extended through technology into conditions where human eyes were useless. By early 1944, radar bombing had become standard procedure for the 8th and 15th Air Forces. Formations now included specialized Pathfinder aircraft in a ratio of roughly 1 per combat wing, their H2X operators coordinating with lead bombardiers to find and strike targets that remained invisible beneath cloud cover. The legendary missions of early 1944 strikes on synthetic oil plants, aircraft factories, and transportation networks were made possible not by the Norden site alone, but by its marriage to radar technology. The oil campaign that crippled German mobility in the war's final year depended on finding and destroying refineries scattered across occupied Europe, many located in regions where weather obscured targets for weeks at a time. Without radar, those strikes could not have been executed with sufficient frequency and accuracy to achieve strategic effects. The technology that in 1942 did not exist, and in 1943 was experimental, had by 1944 become the indispensable foundation of American bombing operations. The symbolic object that represented this transformation was not a weapon or food item, but rather the cathode ray tube itself, that small, circular screen, glowing green in the darkness of a bomber's nose compartment, showing an electronic map of the world below. To aircrews who had watched friends die over obscured targets, who had flown through curtains of flak, hoping desperately for a break in the clouds that never came, the radar scope represented something almost magical, the ability to see through the armor of weather that protected enemy industry. German commanders had counted on European meteorology as a defense. Their factories had been positioned partially with weather patterns in mind, knowing that for much of the year, cloud cover would make precision attack impossible. The H2X shattered that assumption. The radar scope became a talisman against helplessness, a technology that restored agency to crews who had felt powerless against the dual enemies of German fighters and omnipresent clouds. Yet accuracy remained relative. Even with H2X, radar bombing never achieved the pinpoint precision of visual attacks under ideal conditions. The technology could place bombs within a quarter-mile circle at best, more often within a half-mile spread. By peacetime standards, this was wildly imprecise. By wartime standards, against industrial targets measuring hundreds of yards across, it was sufficient. The oil refineries, marshalling yards, and aircraft plants that were strategic priorities were large enough that bombs falling within a half-mile circle would still inflict significant damage. The American strategic bombing campaign evolved to reflect this reality. Precision bombing did not mean hitting a specific building. It meant hitting a specific industrial complex. The moral distinction between precision and area bombing blurred at the edges but remained meaningful. American and British bombers still attacked different target sets with different goals, the Americans seeking to destroy production capacity, the British seeking to destroy cities themselves. The technology had not eliminated the gulf between precision and area bombing, but it had made precision bombing possible under the conditions that actually existed over Europe, rather than the idealized conditions that had existed in pre-war planning. The transformation in capability between 1942 and 1944 was staggering. In August 1942, a dozen B-17 seconds attacked a rail yard in France on a clear day with fighter escort, and this was considered a major achievement. By June 1944, The 8th Air Force could dispatch 2,000 bombers against targets across Germany regardless of weather, with pathfinders using H2X to guide formations through solid cloud cover, and fighter escorts with drop tanks providing protection all the way to Berlin and back. The force that could barely reach occupied France had become an armada capable of striking any target in the Reich at will. Much of this transformation came from increasing numbers and improved tactics, but the technological leap from visual bombing to radar-directed strikes was equally crucial. Without H2X and its continued refinement, the strategic bombing campaign would have remained hostage to weather, effective for perhaps a third of the year, and grounded the rest. German efforts to counter radar bombing were extensive but ultimately inadequate. The Luftwaffe attempted to jam Allied radar frequencies, with limited success. Some German cities employed elaborate decoy complexes designed to show false radar signatures, hoping to draw bombs away from real industrial sites. These measures achieved occasional tactical successes, but could not alter the strategic reality. Allied bombers could now find and strike targets that should have been protected by darkness and weather. The technology that German scientists had pioneered before the war, radar itself had been developed simultaneously in several nations, had been refined by Anglo-American engineers into a weapon that negated one of Germany's key defensive advantages. The night and the clouds that had once been sanctuaries became transparent, and no amount of jamming or deception could fully restore that protection. For the bombardiers and radar operators who flew these missions, the experience was surreal. They were fighting a war mediated through electronics, bombing targets they never saw with their own eyes, navigating through sky that was uniformly grey in all directions, trusting in instruments and mathematics to guide bombs to destinations miles below. The visceral reality of combat fighters attacking, flak bursting remained immediate and terrifying. But the act of bombing itself became abstract, a matter of coordinates and scope readings, rather than the visual confirmation that earlier generations of bombardiers had relied upon. In some ways, this made the killing easier, a psychological distance that transformed dropping high explosives on human beings into a technical problem with right and wrong solutions. In other ways, it made it harder, because crews never knew with certainty whether they had succeeded, whether the green blob on the radar scope they had bombed was actually the factory they sought, or merely an artifact of electronic interference and their own desperate hope. The Norden bombsight, once the centerpiece of American precision doctrine, had not become obsolete, but rather integrated into a larger technological system. The device still calculated trajectories and release points, but now it did so using data fed from radar operators rather than the bombardier's own eye. The two technologies complemented each other. The Norden's mechanical computing power combined with radar's ability to see through weather created a hybrid system more capable than either alone. This integration foreshadowed the future of military technology, not individual wonder weapons, but rather interconnected systems where sensors, computers, and weapons formed unified packages. The age of electronic warfare had not fully arrived, but it was visible on the horizon, and the H2X radar was among its first heralds. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies advanced into Germany from east and west, strategic bombing had achieved many, though not all, of its objectives. German oil production had been strangled, transportation networks shattered, aircraft production disrupted despite desperate German efforts at dispersal and concealment. The bombing campaign had not won the war alone that would require the ground armies, but it had starved German industry of resources and forced the diversion of massive assets to air defense. Hundreds of thousands of flak guns and their crews, thousands of fighters and pilots, vast quantities of ammunition and fuel had been committed to defending the Reich from aerial attack, resources that could otherwise have been deployed against Soviet or Western ground forces. The counterfactual is unknowable, but it is difficult to imagine Germany sustaining its defensive efforts as long as it did without the industrial capacity that bombing destroyed or the military assets that air defense consumed. The accuracy question that had consumed American planners in 1942 had been answered not with a single solution, but with a hierarchy of approaches. When weather permitted and defenses allowed, visual bombing with the Norden sight remained the most accurate method, capable of striking individual buildings. When clouds obscured targets but conditions otherwise favored attack, radar bombing with H2X offered sufficient accuracy for large industrial complexes. When weather and defenses both proved prohibitive, area bombing became the fallback, not the preferred method, but an accepted reality when strategic necessity demanded that something be struck, even if precision was impossible. This pragmatic adaptation represented maturity in doctrine, a recognition that wars are fought under actual conditions rather than ideal ones, and that technology must serve strategy rather than dictating it. The human cost of learning these lessons had been catastrophic. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 26,000 killed and 28,000 captured or missing during the European campaign, casualty rates exceeding those of any other American military branch, except perhaps the Marine Corps in the Pacific. Each percentage point of improved accuracy, each technological refinement that allowed strikes under worsening conditions, had been paid for in the blood of young men who flew into skies filled with steel and fire. The bomber crews who survived to war's end were statistically lucky in a way that defied comprehension. They had beaten odds that killed most of their friends, had completed mission tours that models suggested should have been impossible to survive. They returned home to a nation that celebrated their service, but could never fully understand the specific terror of fighting at 40 below zero in a machine that could be destroyed by a single well-placed shell, above cities that vanished beneath clouds that their bombs plunged through toward targets they could only hope they had hit. The technological legacy of wartime radar bombing extended far beyond military applications. The engineers who developed H2X and its successors carried that expertise into peacetime industries. Radar technology refined for penetrating weather over Germany became the foundation for commercial aviation navigation systems, weather forecasting, and eventually air traffic control networks that made modern aviation possible. The concept of attacking targets that could not be directly observed prefigured precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles, and GPS-guided bombs, all descendants of that first primitive marriage between mechanical bomb sights and ground-mapping radar. The war had forced innovation at a pace unprecedented in technological history, compressing development timelines that would have normally taken decades into months or years. H2X represented just one branch of that forced evolution, but it was a crucial one, demonstrating that electronics and computing still in their infancy could solve problems that human senses and mechanical devices could not. The ideological implications were equally profound. American precision bombing doctrine had emerged from a worldview that combined technological optimism with moral constraint. The belief that American ingenuity could create weapons of such sophistication that wars could be fought without. The wholesale slaughter of previous eras. The reality proved more complex and more brutal than the theory, but the core insight that technology could extend capability beyond human limitations proved valid. The radar scope, glowing in the darkness of a bomber's nose, was not just a military tool but a symbol of modernity itself, of humanity's expanding ability to perceive and act upon a world that natural senses could not fully access. It represented both the promise and the peril of technological warfare. The promise that precision might someday reduce the horror of combat, the peril that greater capability would merely enable more efficient destruction. In the frozen January sky over Wilhelmshaven, where this story began, Lieutenant Howard and Sergeant Swenson were testing a doctrine that would not fully mature for another year. That first major American raid against Germany proceeded with visual bombing. The target was partially visible through breaks in clouds, and the Norden sight performed as designed. But within weeks, missions would fly into solid overcast, and bombardiers would return frustrated, their technology useless against weather. The learning curve would be steep and bloody. Some lessons could only be learned through failure, and the price of failure in aerial warfare was measured in burning bombers spiraling toward frozen earth. Yet from those failures emerged adaptation. American military culture in World War II proved remarkably flexible despite its commitment to pre-war doctrine. When reality contradicted theory, theory was modified rather than reality denied. The daylight precision doctrine was not abandoned. It remained the ideal and the preferred method, but it was supplemented and extended through technology until it could function under real-world conditions. This pragmatic evolution, driven by officers and engineers who prioritized victory over doctrinal purity, may have been America's most important advantage. The Soviet Union would mass-produce tanks and aircraft in quantities that dwarfed all other combatants. Nazi Germany would achieve qualitative superiority in numerous weapons systems. Britain would demonstrate resilience and courage that sustained the alliance through its darkest moments. But America contributed industrial capacity combined with technological innovation and doctrinal flexibility, a combination that allowed rapid iteration, learning, and improvement. The Norden Bombsight, that device which had consumed so much pre-war faith and funding, ended the war not obsolete, but transformed. It remained installed in every American bomber, but now it was one component in a system rather than the system itself. The engineers who had designed it in the 1,930 seconds could not have imagined its integration with technologies that did not exist when their work began. This, too, was a lesson, that tools must evolve with needs, that even the most sophisticated device becomes inadequate when conditions change, and that true technological superiority lies not in possessing wonder weapons, but in the capacity to integrate, adapt, and improve systems as circumstances demand. April 1945, the war in Europe approaching its end. American bombers still flew, though targets grew scarce as Allied armies overran what remained of the Reich. The great industrial complexes that had been struck again and again lay in ruins, their production lines silent, their workers dispersed or dead. In bombers crossing German airspace in those final weeks, radar operators still hunched over H2X scopes, tracking roads and rivers across a landscape transformed by years of war. But the urgency had drained from these missions. The outcome was no longer in doubt, and each raid was less about strategic necessity than about hastening an inevitable conclusion. The men who flew those final missions had survived experiences that should have killed them. They had watched the technological evolution of their war in real time, had learned to trust instruments over instinct, had come to accept that targets they bombed might be invisible, but were no less real for that invisibility. They represented a new kind of warrior, one whose primary relationship with the enemy was mediated through electronics and mathematics, who fought battles at distances that precluded any human connection between killer and killed. This was the future of warfare, though few yet recognized it. The atomic bombs that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August would be delivered visually, under clear skies, with crews who saw the flash and mushroom cloud with their own eyes. But the trajectory was clear. Warfare was becoming increasingly abstract, increasingly dependent on technologies that extended perception and lethality beyond the range of human senses. The transformation from failed night bombing in 1942 to all-weather capability in 1944 represented more than tactical adaptation. It symbolized a fundamental shift in the relationship between technology and warfare, one that would define military conflict for the remainder of the century and beyond. The idea that darkness and weather could provide sanctuary, that natural conditions might limit human destructive capacity, had been rendered obsolete. The electronic eye could see what the human eye could not, and what could be seen could be destroyed. This was the ultimate expression of modernity's promise, and its threat that no barrier would remain impenetrable to human ingenuity, that every defense would eventually be overcome by some new technology, that the capacity for destruction would continue expanding so long as scientific progress continued. The green glow of the radar scope, phosphorescent and ghostly, illuminating a young operator's face in the darkness of a bomber's compartment, became the icon of this new age. It was beautiful in its way, an artificial eye opening on a world invisible to natural sight, a triumph of human cleverness over the limitations of biology. It was also terrible, because that artificial eye existed to guide bombs to targets where human beings worked and lived, where the abstraction on the scope represented concrete structures filled with concrete people who would die when high explosives detonated. The technology was morally neutral, the use was not. But that distinction grew harder to maintain as the war ground on, as exhaustion and familiarity dulled the sharp edge of moral questioning, as survival became its own justification and victory its own virtue. In the end, American precision bombing achieved what it set out to accomplish, though not in the way its pre-war architects had envisioned. Strategic bombing did not win the war alone, but it contributed substantially to victory by destroying Germany's industrial capacity and forcing massive resource diversions to air defense. The Norden bombsight did not make bombing into a surgical instrument, but when coupled with radar technology, it allowed strikes under conditions that would otherwise have prohibited any bombing at all. The doctrine that required modification, adaptation, and technological supplementation survived and proved effective, validating the core insight that precision attack on industrial targets could achieve strategic effects without the total warfare of earlier eras, though the distinction between precision and area bombing became far more ambiguous in practice than in theory. The men who made this possible, the bombardiers, radar operators, pilots, and navigators who flew into the storm of steel day after day, mission after mission, did not think in terms of doctrine or historical significance. They thought about survival, about completing their tour and going home, about the friends who had died in aircraft that simply fell out of formation, leaving no trace but a smudge of smoke in the winter sky. They adapted to technologies that changed mid-war, learned new skills while under fire, and somehow maintained sanity in circumstances that should have shattered any rational mind. Their pragmatism and courage made the technological evolution possible. Radar bombing required not just electronic systems but human operators willing to trust those systems when every instinct screamed that bombing invisible targets made no sense, that releasing high explosives without visual confirmation was madness. The legacy of that transformation echoes through every precision strike conducted since 1945. When modern aircraft attack targets at night or in weather, using GPS and laser guidance to achieve accuracies measured in feet rather than miles, they are inheritors of the radar bombing pioneers who proved that darkness and clouds need not be sanctuaries. The technology has evolved beyond recognition. The H2X scope's crude green images replaced by high-definition infrared feeds and synthetic aperture radar with resolutions that reveal individual vehicles. But the concept remains unchanged. Extend human perception through electronics, translate that perception into weapons guidance, and strike with precision regardless of conditions. The journey from helpless frustration over invisible targets in 1942 to all-weather capability in 1944 to satellite-guided munitions in the 21st century is a direct line. Each advancement building on previous breakthroughs, each generation of technology expanding the sphere of human lethality. And so the story of America's night-bombing accuracy, or rather its initial lack thereof, and subsequent technological solution, becomes a parable about adaptation and innovation under existential pressure. Doctrine failed reality, and rather than deny reality, doctrine was changed. Technology proved inadequate, and rather than accept inadequacy, new technology was rapidly developed and deployed. Theory met practice and bent to accommodate it, and in that bending demonstrated the flexibility that would characterize American military culture throughout the Cold War and beyond. The green glow of the radar scope was more than a tool. It was a declaration that no natural limitation would constrain human will, that ingenuity and industry could overcome any obstacle, that the American faith in technology as solution to all problems was not misplaced, but merely required constant innovation to maintain. The price of that faith was paid by young men who died testing theories, who burned to death in aircraft over cities they could not see, who disappeared into clouds and never emerged. Their sacrifice purchased knowledge, bought with blood the understanding that would guide future generations. The radar operators who survived carried that knowledge forward, along with memories of friends who had not, and in the decades that followed, as technology continued its relentless advance. Perhaps some of them wondered whether humanity's increasing power to destroy would ever be matched by wisdom in its application. The question remains unanswered, but the trajectory is clear. What can be seen can be struck, what can be measured can be destroyed, and the capacity for precision grows alongside the capacity for destruction, locked in an eternal race toward a horizon that recedes as fast as we approach it. In the winter darkness over Germany, in those desperate months when the outcome of the war still hung in balance, American airmen learned to trust in technologies they did not fully understand, to bomb targets they could not see, to fight a war that had become as much about electronics and mathematics as courage and skill. They adapted because they had to, because survival and victory demanded it, because the alternative was defeat. And in that adaptation, they transformed warfare itself, ushering in an age where perception would be electronic, targeting would be computational, and no night would be dark enough, no weather bad enough, to provide sanctuary from bombs falling through invisible skies toward targets marked by nothing more than coordinates on a screen, and the faith that somewhere below, hidden by clouds or darkness, those coordinates represented something real, something strategic, something worthy of destruction. Whether that faith was justified, whether the destruction achieved the intended ends, whether the costs measured in lives and cities were proportionate to the gains, these questions belong to historians and ethicists. But the technological fact remains. America had no night-bombing accuracy in 1942, and within 2 years, through desperation and innovation, through the marriage of mechanical bombsights and electronic radar, through the courage of men willing to test untried systems under fire, that accuracy was achieved. The Norden and H2X had taken over, and the nature of aerial warfare was forever changed.